A gray, cold Tuesday in Toronto, big money shifting in Ottawa, and Olympic hockey rolling in Italy. And later in the brief, the one Canada-US flashpoint that could hit trade and travel at the border sooner than you'd think. Toronto's weather first. Cloudy today, around -1 degrees Celsius, with light snow around the region. And if you were digging out from the weekend's bigger snowfall, you're not alone. Toronto has been dealing with some of the season's heaviest snow and a run of bitter air. That's also been knocking local plans around, with some events getting canceled or rescheduled. On the lighter side, the city's mid-February calendar is still packed. Live music, nightlife, and a Raptors home date this week against Detroit. And with the Winter Olympics now underway, a lot of venues are leaning into group screenings, which is quickly becoming the default winter night out option. Sports check-in. For Toronto FC, the clock is getting loud. The season opener is Feb 21st in Dallas, and the roster still has visible gaps, especially in attack, after a 2025 season where goals were hard to come by. They've added help in defense and in goal, and they're still linked to a potential move for a U.S. striker, with another forward deal expected soon. And in baseball, pitchers and catchers report for the Blue Jays this week. After a winter of big spending, over $300 million in new contracts aimed squarely at a 2026 title run. The trade-off is that some familiar names are gone, including a major bat in the lineup, and the question now is whether the replacements are enough. Turning now to the bigger thread, Canada's economic and political exposure to U.S. pressure is widening, and the signals today are coming from both trade and infrastructure. The most immediate flare-up is over Canada's recent trade engagement with China. Mark Carney's trip produced a narrower deal, lower tariffs on Canadian canola oil, and some access for Canadian electric vehicles, rather than a broad free trade agreement. But in Washington, President Donald Trump responded by threatening a 100% tariff on Canadian goods and warning publicly that China will eat Canada alive. The U.S. administration also suggested Canada may have violated the Canada-U.S.-Mexico Agreement, or CUSMA. Here's the key point. Trade experts quoted in the reporting say Canada did not break existing trade agreements by making this China deal, partly because it wasn't a comprehensive free trade pact, and because countries can strike certain sectoral arrangements without automatically triggering CUSMA violations. What experts are more concerned about is the tactic, that the U.S. is creating the perception of a breach to justify retaliation, especially with CUSMA renegotiation politics looming. And that takes us to the second front, the Gordie Howe International Bridge, Canada's new major Windsor-Detroit crossing, a $6.4 billion project widely reported as fully funded by the Canadian federal government. Trump is now threatening to block the bridge from opening unless the U.S. is fully compensated, and he's demanding negotiations for at least half ownership. Canadian officials and local leaders are pushing back, pointing to the existing 2012 Canada-Michigan crossing agreement and the current structure, public ownership involving Canada and Michigan, operated by a Canadian Crown corporation, with Canada set to recoup costs through tolls on the Canadian side. The risk here is less about the concrete and steel. Construction is basically done, with final testing and inspections underway, and more about what this signals. If major cross-border infrastructure can be pulled into broader trade disputes, it adds uncertainty for the region's auto and logistics corridor, even before any formal policy changes land. Mid-episode reset. Remember that tease at the top. The border flashpoint to watch is this bridge, because it's tied to an expected opening early this year, and it sits right in the middle of the trade conversation. While all that plays out, Ottawa is also moving on several major files at once. 1. Foreign interference rules. The public safety minister says the government will amend proposed regulations to raise the minimum fine above the originally proposed $50. The ceiling is still described as up to $1 million, and the enforcement details will sit with a transparency commissioner using factors like whether a breach was knowing and whether there's a history of violations. The government says changes should be published in the Canada Gazette in the coming weeks. 2. Defense procurement. Ottawa has begun paying for long lead components for 14 additional F-35 fighter jets beyond the first 16 already contracted, moves meant to keep Canada's place in the production line. National Defense isn't confirming new funding and says a broader purchase review is still underway, launched amid trade tensions with the U.S. That tension matters here because it complicates how Canada balances capability, cost, and supply chain dependence. 3. Canada Post. The federal government is providing a $1.01 billion repayable loan as a short-term bridge to keep services operating while a transformation plan is finalized. Ottawa is still emphasizing that Canada Post has to become financially self-sustaining, but the immediate priority is continuity of service. Back closer to home, housing is still the big municipal stress test. Toronto's proposed 2026 budget includes a 2.2% property tax increase, alongside added funding for transit and police. The city says the lower tax increase is partly enabled by new taxes targeted at home speculators and the top 2% of luxury home buyers. Critics are questioning long-term sustainability. The mayor's office frames it as affordability-focused budgeting. Nationally, the federal government has introduced legislation to formalize Build Canada Homes as a Crown corporation, folding in the Canada Lands Company and giving it land acquisition and development powers, including partnerships with private developers. What's missing so far is a clear unit target or performance benchmarks, something experts say is needed so the public can measure success beyond announcements. Quick Olympics note before we wrap. In women's hockey at the Milan Cortina Games, the United States stayed perfect with a 5-1 win over Switzerland, its third straight victory. Caroline Harvey and Joy Dunn each had a goal and 2 assists, and goalie Gwyneth Phillips made 20 saves in her Olympic debut for the shutout. And one small modern reminder from these games, a viral clip claiming Team USA walked into the opening ceremony to a song as a dig at Canada turned out to be AI-generated with visible errors and a watermark. It's a useful caution. Olympic social feeds move fast, and not all of it is real. The final piece to watch today: timelines. The opening is expected early this year, so any formal U.S. effort to slow or complicate it would show up soon in negotiations, legal positioning, or border planning. On trade, the question is whether tariff threats turn into specific measures or stay as leverage heading into CUSMA talks. And on housing and budgets, look for clearer targets, units, timelines, and what success is going to mean in practice. That's the brief for Tuesday, February 10th. Thanks for listening.